Marcus Wellington stepped out of his black Mercedes, adjusting his expensive suit as he approached the massive iron gates of his Beverly Hills mansion. The 45-year-old real estate tycoon had built an empire worth over $200 million, owning luxury properties across 3 states. His success story was legendary in business circles, rising from a middle-class background to become one of the most powerful developers on the West Coast. The mansion stood like a fortress behind manicured gardens, its white columns gleaming in the afternoon sun. Marcus had purchased the property 5 years ago for $30 million, turning it into his personal sanctuary. The house boasted 12 bedrooms, 8 bathrooms, a wine cellar, indoor pool, and a lounge that could easily host 50 guests. Every corner reflected wealth and status, from the Italian marble floors to the crystal chandeliers imported from Austria. As Marcus walked through the front door, he was greeted by the familiar scent of lemon polish and fresh flowers. His housekeeper, Dorothy Williams, had been maintaining the mansion for 3 years with remarkable dedication. The 62-year-old African-American woman had responded to his job advertisement when his previous cleaning service proved unreliable. Dorothy lived in a small apartment 20 minutes away and arrived each morning at 7 sharp, working until evening to keep the massive house spotless. Marcus barely interacted with Dorothy beyond giving instructions or expressing dissatisfaction when something wasn't perfect. He saw her as just another employee, someone who performed a service in exchange for payment. Their conversations were brief and purely functional. Dorothy would nod respectfully, complete her tasks efficiently, and leave without causing any disruption to his busy schedule. What Marcus didn't know was that Dorothy had been observing him for months. She noticed how he lived alone in the enormous house, how business associates visited for meetings but rarely stayed for dinner, how he worked late into the night surrounded by contracts and financial documents. Despite his wealth, Dorothy sensed a deep loneliness in the man who owned everything but seemed to enjoy very little. Dorothy had her own story of struggle and resilience. Born in rural Alabama, she had moved to Los Angeles 30 years ago seeking better opportunities. She had worked various jobs to support her family, from restaurant kitchens to hotel housekeeping. Her late husband had been a mechanic, and together they had raised 2 children who now lived in different states with families of their own. Dorothy's modest income barely covered her rent and expenses, but she never complained or asked for advances on her salary. The mansion's lounge was Dorothy's favorite room to clean. The spacious area featured floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the garden, comfortable leather furniture arranged around a stone fireplace, and built-in bookcases filled with volumes that Marcus never seemed to read. The room had potential for warmth and gathering, but it felt cold and unused. Marcus occasionally entertained business clients there, but the conversations were always about deals, profits, and acquisitions. One Tuesday morning, Dorothy arrived to find Marcus pacing in his home office, shouting into his phone about a failed property deal. His face was red with anger, and papers were scattered across his desk. She quietly began dusting the adjacent hallway, overhearing fragments of the heated conversation. The deal had fallen through due to zoning issues, costing Marcus millions in potential profits. When he finally ended the call, he slammed the phone down and stormed out of the house without acknowledging Dorothy's presence. That afternoon, while cleaning the lounge, Dorothy found herself thinking about the empty space and its possibilities. The room was larger than her entire apartment, yet it served no meaningful purpose in Marcus's life. She had grown up in a community where neighbors helped each other, where homes were gathering places for families and friends. The contrast between her childhood memories and this sterile mansion struck her powerfully. Dorothy's thoughts drifted to her volunteer work at a local community center. Every weekend, she helped serve meals to homeless families and played with children whose parents struggled to make ends meet. She had seen firsthand how many kids had nowhere safe to go after school, how some slept in cars or overcrowded shelters. The need for stable housing and care was overwhelming, while this beautiful room sat empty day after day. As she polished the mahogany coffee table, Dorothy began to envision something different. The lounge could accommodate several small beds, the adjoining kitchen could prepare meals for hungry children, and the garden could provide outdoor play space. The idea seemed impossible, even foolish. Marcus would never agree to such a thing, and she was just a housekeeper with no authority to make changes. But the seed of an idea had been planted. Dorothy continued her work that day with unusual energy, mentally measuring spaces and considering logistics. She knew the mansion's layout better than anyone, understanding how rooms connected and where supplies were stored. Her years of experience managing households had taught her efficiency and organization skills that could be valuable in running any kind of residential program. When Marcus returned that evening, he seemed calmer but still distracted. He ate dinner alone in the dining room while reviewing documents, barely touching the meal Dorothy had prepared. She cleaned the kitchen quietly, her mind still racing with possibilities. The contrast between Marcus's solitary existence and the potential for the house to shelter vulnerable children created a tension she couldn't ignore. Dorothy had always been a woman of action rather than just dreams. Growing up poor had taught her that waiting for permission or perfect conditions meant nothing would ever change. She had learned to see opportunities where others saw obstacles, to find solutions rather than focus on problems. As she prepared to leave the mansion that evening, she made a decision that would change both her life and Marcus's forever. Walking to her car, Dorothy took one last look at the impressive house. Tomorrow would bring new possibilities, and she was determined to find a way to transform the unused lounge into something meaningful. She didn't yet know how she would convince Marcus or overcome the practical obstacles, but she knew the need was real and the opportunity was there. Sometimes, she thought, the most important changes begin with a single person willing to take the first step, regardless of the consequences. Dorothy Williams arrived at work the next morning with nervous energy coursing through her veins. She had spent the entire night thinking about her bold plan, considering every detail and potential obstacle. The idea of transforming Marcus Wellington's unused lounge into a temporary shelter for homeless children seemed both necessary and impossible. She knew she was risking her job, but something deep inside her refused to let the opportunity pass. Her first task was gathering information. Dorothy had connections throughout the community from her volunteer work, and she began making quiet phone calls during her lunch breaks. She contacted Maria Santos, a social worker at the downtown community center, who immediately understood the magnitude of what Dorothy was proposing. "Dorothy, honey, we have over 40 children on our waiting list for safe housing," Maria explained over the phone. "Some are sleeping in their families' cars. Others are staying in overcrowded relatives' homes. Just last week we had to turn away a mother with 3 kids because every shelter was full. But what you're suggesting, it would require permits, inspections, insurance. It's not just about having space." Despite the challenges, Maria agreed to help Dorothy research the legal requirements. They discovered that temporary emergency housing could be established with proper documentation and safety measures. The process would require approval from social services, fire department clearance, and basic facilities like separate sleeping areas, adequate bathroom access, and kitchen facilities for meal preparation. Dorothy spent her days cleaning the mansion while secretly planning the transformation. She measured the lounge carefully, noting that it could accommodate 6 to 8 small beds with enough space for children to move around comfortably. The adjacent bathroom could serve their needs, and the kitchen was already equipped to prepare meals for many people. The mansion's security system and gated entrance would provide safety that most shelters couldn't offer. Meanwhile, Marcus remained completely unaware of Dorothy's activities. He was consumed with salvaging his failed property deal and pursuing new investments. His days were filled with phone calls to lawyers, architects, and city officials. He ate his meals quickly, barely acknowledging Dorothy's presence as she served him and cleaned around his paperwork. The lounge remained empty except for his occasional business meetings. On Friday afternoon, Dorothy made a decision that terrified and excited her. While Marcus was out meeting with investors, she contacted 3 families from Maria's waiting list and invited them to see the space. She knew she was crossing a line, but she felt compelled to show them what was possible before approaching Marcus with her proposal. The first family arrived at 2 o'clock. Carmen Rodriguez came with her 7-year-old son Luis and 9-year-old daughter Isabella. They had been staying in Carmen's car for 2 weeks after being evicted from their apartment. Carmen worked 2 part-time jobs but couldn't afford the security deposit for a new rental. When Dorothy opened the mansion's front door, the children's eyes widened in amazement. "This is like a palace, Mama," Isabella whispered, staring at the marble entryway and crystal chandelier. Dorothy led them to the lounge, explaining her vision for converting the space into temporary housing. Carmen listened carefully, asking practical questions about how long families could stay and what rules would apply. Despite her gratitude, she seemed worried about the arrangement's legitimacy. "Mrs. Dorothy, this is beautiful and we're desperate. But what if the owner changes his mind? What if we get comfortable and then have to leave suddenly? My children have already been through so much disruption." Dorothy understood Carmen's concerns, but assured her that she would work out all details with Marcus before any families moved in. She gave Carmen her phone number and promised to contact her within a week with a definitive answer. The second family, James and Patricia Johnson with their twin 6-year-old boys, had been staying in an overcrowded shelter where violence and theft were constant concerns. Patricia had recently lost her job as a retail clerk, and James's construction work was irregular. They were grateful for any option that could provide their children with stability and safety. The third visitor was 16-year-old Ashley Thompson, who had been aging out of the foster care system. She was technically still a minor, but had been living independently for months, sleeping on friends' couches and sometimes in her old high school's parking lot. Ashley was bright and determined, working part-time at a fast food restaurant while finishing her senior year. She needed just a few months of stable housing to graduate and begin community college. "I promise I wouldn't be any trouble," Ashley told Dorothy earnestly. "I just need somewhere safe until I can save enough money for my own place. I've been on my own for so long, I know how to take care of myself." Each family's story reinforced Dorothy's conviction that the mansion's resources should be shared with those in desperate need. She saw the potential for creating more than just temporary housing, but a supportive community where families could rebuild their lives. The mansion's isolating grandeur could become a nurturing environment where children could feel safe, and adults could focus on finding employment and permanent housing. After the families left, Dorothy sat alone in the lounge, feeling the weight of responsibility she had taken on. She was no longer just a housekeeper with a compassionate idea. She had made promises to vulnerable people who were counting on her to follow through. The fear of Marcus's reaction battled with her determination to help families in crisis. That evening, as she prepared to leave work, Dorothy decided she could no longer delay the conversation with Marcus. She would approach him the next Monday morning and present her proposal professionally and thoroughly. She spent the weekend preparing a detailed plan, including information about legal requirements, safety measures, and the positive publicity his involvement could generate for his business. Dorothy also contacted Reverend Michael Davis from her church, who had experience with community housing programs. Reverend Davis agreed to meet with Marcus if needed, to discuss the spiritual and community benefits of the shelter. He offered to help recruit volunteers and coordinate donations of furniture, bedding, and supplies. By Sunday evening, Dorothy had assembled a comprehensive proposal that addressed practical concerns while emphasizing the humanitarian impact. She had identified funding sources for food and utilities, volunteers willing to help with childcare and tutoring, and community organizations eager to support the initiative. All she needed now was Marcus Wellington's permission to transform his empty lounge into a beacon of hope for families in crisis. Dorothy knew that Monday morning would determine whether her bold dream would become reality or cost her the job she needed to survive. But looking at the photos the families had shared of their children, she felt certain she was making the right choice. Monday morning arrived with unusual tension in the Wellington mansion. Dorothy had barely slept, rehearsing her presentation dozens of times and imagining every possible reaction from Marcus. She arrived at work 30 minutes early, using the extra time to review her proposal one final time and steady her nerves. The manila folder containing her research felt heavy in her hands, weighted with the hopes of the families she had promised to help. Marcus appeared in the kitchen at his usual time, wearing an expensive navy suit and checking messages on his phone. He poured coffee from the machine Dorothy had prepared and grabbed a bagel from the counter without looking up from his device. This was the moment Dorothy had been preparing for, but seeing him in his typical rush made her hesitate. "Mr. Wellington," she began carefully, her voice slightly shaky. "I was wondering if I could speak with you about something important when you have a few minutes." Marcus glanced up briefly, noting the unusual formal tone in Dorothy's voice. In 3 years, she had never requested a private conversation, always limiting their interactions to brief acknowledgments and work-related questions. "I'm running late for a meeting downtown," he replied, already moving toward the door. "Whatever it is, can it wait until this evening?" Dorothy felt her courage wavering but forced herself to persist. Actually, sir, it's quite urgent. It involves the house and could affect your schedule today. Maybe just 5 minutes? Something in Dorothy's tone made Marcus pause. He looked at her more carefully, noticing the folder in her hands and the determined expression on her face. His business instincts, honed by years of negotiations, sensed that this wasn't a routine household matter. All right, Dorothy, 5 minutes. Let's sit in the dining room. They moved to the formal dining room where Marcus remained standing while Dorothy took a seat at the massive mahogany table. She opened her folder with trembling hands and began her carefully prepared presentation. Mr. Wellington, I've been working in your home for 3 years, and I've noticed that the lounge area is rarely used. Meanwhile, I volunteer at the community center downtown, and we have desperate families with children who have nowhere safe to sleep. Marcus's expression shifted from mild curiosity to confusion and then to something approaching alarm. Dorothy, where exactly is this conversation going? Dorothy took a deep breath and continued. I'm proposing to temporarily convert your lounge into emergency housing for homeless families with children. We could accommodate 6 to 8 people, providing them with safety and stability while they work toward permanent housing solutions. The silence that followed felt endless. Marcus stared at Dorothy as if she had suggested burning down the mansion. His face went through several expressions: shock, disbelief, and then growing anger. You want to turn my home into a homeless shelter? His voice was quiet but carried an edge that made Dorothy's stomach clench. Are you completely out of your mind? Dorothy had anticipated this reaction and forced herself to remain calm. Sir, I understand it sounds unusual, but I've researched all the legal requirements. We can get proper permits and insurance. The families would be carefully screened and there would be strict rules about behavior and cleanliness. Marcus began pacing around the table, his initial shock giving way to indignation. Dorothy, this is a private residence worth $30 million. I don't run a charity organization. I hired you to clean my house, not to redesign it as a social services facility. But the space is sitting empty. Dorothy pressed on, knowing she might never get another chance to make her case. Those rooms could provide safety for children who are sleeping in cars or dangerous shelters. We could save lives without any real cost to you. No real cost? Marcus's voice rose. What about my privacy, my security, my property values? What about insurance liability if someone gets hurt? What happens when these people refuse to leave or cause damage to my house? Dorothy pulled out several papers from her folder. I've spoken with social workers and community organizations. They would help screen applicants and provide ongoing support. The families would sign agreements about length of stay and behavior expectations. Most of them just need a few months to get back on their feet. Marcus stopped pacing and looked directly at Dorothy. Have you already spoken to people about this? Have you been discussing my personal business and property with strangers? Dorothy realized she had made a mistake in mentioning her research so specifically. I only spoke with professionals about hypothetical situations. I wanted to make sure the plan was realistic before presenting it to you. Hypothetical situations? Marcus's anger was building. Dorothy, you've been planning to turn my home into a shelter without my knowledge or permission. You've been discussing my property with social workers and community activists. This is completely inappropriate. Dorothy felt tears forming but refused to let them fall. Mr. Wellington, I know I should have spoken to you first, but I wanted to show you that it could work. These families are desperate, especially the children. Isabella is 9 years old and has been sleeping in a car for 2 weeks. Ashley is trying to finish high school while living on the street. Marcus held up his hand to stop her. I don't want to hear their individual stories. That's not my responsibility. I work hard for what I have, and I have every right to enjoy my property in peace. Dorothy stood up, her voice becoming stronger despite her fear. You have 12 bedrooms in this house and live alone. The lounge hasn't been used for anything meaningful in months. Meanwhile, children are cold and scared and have nowhere safe to go. That's not my problem, Marcus replied firmly. There are government agencies and established charities to handle homeless issues. I pay taxes that support social services. I don't need to personally house strangers in my living room. Dorothy gathered her papers, realizing that logical arguments weren't going to change Marcus's mind. Sir, what if we started with just one family? Just for a month? You would barely know they were here. Marcus walked toward the door, signaling that the conversation was over. Dorothy, the answer is absolutely not. Not one family, not for one day. This is my home, and I won't have it turned into some kind of communal housing project. He paused at the doorway and looked back at her. I'm disappointed that you would even suggest this without considering how inappropriate it is. You're my housekeeper, not my social conscience or business advisor. I expect you to focus on your job duties and leave my personal decisions to me. Dorothy stood alone in the dining room, watching Marcus leave for his business meeting. She had expected rejection but hadn't anticipated feeling quite so crushed by his dismissive attitude. The families she had met were counting on her, and she had failed them before even getting a real chance to advocate for their needs. As she began her cleaning routine, Dorothy's mind raced with alternative approaches. Perhaps she had been too direct, too presumptuous in her presentation. Maybe there was another way to reach Marcus, to help him understand the human cost of his refusal. She wasn't ready to give up on the families who needed help, even if it meant risking her job. For 3 days after their confrontation, Marcus and Dorothy maintained a tense professional distance. Marcus left earlier each morning and returned later each evening, seemingly avoiding extended time in the house. Dorothy performed her duties with quiet efficiency, but the energy between them had shifted dramatically. The comfortable routine they had established over 3 years felt strained and artificial. Dorothy couldn't stop thinking about the families she had met. Carmen Rodriguez had called twice, asking for updates about the shelter possibility. Each time, Dorothy had to explain that she was still working on convincing Marcus, but her voice lacked the confidence it had carried a week earlier. She knew Carmen was growing desperate, and the thought of Isabella and Luis continuing to sleep in their car made Dorothy feel sick with guilt. Meanwhile, Marcus found himself distracted at work. His business meetings lacked their usual focus, and he caught himself staring out his office windows instead of reviewing contracts. He told himself he was simply annoyed by Dorothy's inappropriate suggestion, but something deeper was bothering him. Her words about children sleeping in cars and teenagers living on the street had planted uncomfortable images in his mind. On Thursday evening, Marcus returned home to find Dorothy preparing dinner with unusual attention to detail. She had prepared his favorite meal, grilled salmon with roasted vegetables, and set the dining room table with his finest china and crystal glasses. When he questioned the special treatment, Dorothy explained that she wanted to apologize for overstepping her boundaries. Mr. Wellington, I realize I was completely out of line suggesting changes to your home without your permission, she said as she served his meal. I let my emotions get ahead of my judgment, and I'm sorry for making you uncomfortable. Marcus nodded curtly, accepting the apology while remaining wary of Dorothy's motives. I appreciate that, Dorothy. Let's just return to our normal routine and forget this incident happened. But Dorothy wasn't finished. As she cleared his dishes, she spoke quietly, almost to herself. It's just hard to forget about little Isabella asking her mother why they can't have a real bed to sleep in. Marcus looked up sharply. Dorothy, we discussed this. I don't want to hear about these people's personal situations. Dorothy continued cleaning without looking at him. Of course, sir. I understand. Isabella is only 9 years old, but that's not your concern. Despite himself, Marcus found himself asking, what happened to this family? How did they end up homeless? Dorothy paused in her cleaning, recognizing the crack in Marcus's armor. Carmen works 2 jobs but still couldn't afford rent after her husband left. She's been trying to save money for a security deposit, but living in the car makes it almost impossible to get ahead. Marcus felt uncomfortable with his growing curiosity but couldn't seem to stop himself. What about the other families you mentioned? Dorothy set down the dishes and looked directly at Marcus. James and Patricia Johnson both lost their jobs within a month of each other. They have 6-year-old twin boys who ask why they can't go home. The shelter where they're staying now has a waiting list, and they might have to leave next week with nowhere else to go. Marcus stood abruptly from the table. Dorothy, I can see what you're doing. You're trying to manipulate me with these sob stories. Dorothy shook her head. I'm not trying to manipulate you, sir. I'm just answering your questions. These aren't sob stories. They're real families with real problems. Marcus walked toward his home office, clearly wanting to end the conversation. There are government programs and social services to help these people. It's not my job to solve every homeless person's problems. Dorothy followed him to the doorway. Ashley Thompson is 16 and trying to finish high school while living in her car. She works 20 hours a week at a fast food restaurant and maintains a B average. All she needs is a safe place to sleep for 3 months until graduation. Marcus turned around, his frustration evident. Why are you telling me this? What do you want me to do about it? Dorothy took a deep breath. I want you to visit the community center with me this weekend, just to see what these families are going through. You don't have to make any commitments or change your mind about the shelter. Just see the reality of what homelessness looks like. Marcus stared at her in disbelief. You want me to tour homeless shelters on my weekend? Just 1 hour, Dorothy persisted. Meet Maria Santos, the social worker who coordinates family services. See the overcrowded conditions and understand why families are desperate for alternatives. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with internal conflicts. Dorothy could see him weighing his desire to maintain distance against something that might have been curiosity or conscience. If I do this, and I'm not saying I will, what exactly do you expect to accomplish? I'm not changing my mind about using my house as a shelter. Dorothy nodded. I understand your position, sir. I'm just asking you to see the problem firsthand. Maybe there are other ways you could help that wouldn't involve your home. Marcus found himself considering the proposal despite his better judgment. Part of him was genuinely curious about the situations Dorothy had described, while another part wanted to prove that he wasn't the heartless person she seemed to think he was. 1 hour, he said finally. This Saturday afternoon. But I want it clearly understood that this visit doesn't change anything about my decision regarding the shelter. Dorothy felt a surge of hope, mixed with nervousness. Getting Marcus to visit the community center was a small victory, but she knew it could backfire if he felt manipulated or overwhelmed by what he saw there. Thank you, Mr. Wellington. I'll arrange everything with Maria and make sure she understands this is just an informational visit. Marcus nodded and retreated to his office, already questioning his decision. He had built his successful career by maintaining clear boundaries between business and emotion, between his personal comfort and other people's problems. Dorothy's request threatened to blur those lines in ways that made him deeply uncomfortable. That night, as Dorothy prepared to leave work, she felt a mixture of excitement and terror about Saturday's visit. She had managed to get Marcus to take the first step toward understanding the homeless crisis, but she knew that seeing the family's desperation might either inspire his compassion or reinforce his determination to stay uninvolved. She called Maria Santos to arrange the visit, carefully explaining Marcus's reluctance and the importance of not pressuring him too heavily. Maria agreed to focus on showing him the facility and introducing him to just a few families, letting the situation speak for themselves rather than making direct appeals for help. As Dorothy drove home to her small apartment, she allowed herself to hope that Marcus might discover something about himself during the community center visit. She had seen glimpses of humanity beneath his business-focused exterior, and she believed that exposure to genuine need might awaken whatever compassion he kept hidden behind his success and isolation. Saturday afternoon arrived gray and drizzly, matching Marcus's mood as he drove through unfamiliar neighborhoods toward the community center. He had changed clothes 3 times, unsure whether to dress casually or maintain his usual business attire. Finally settling on khakis and a polo shirt, he felt awkward and out of place before even arriving at his destination. The East Side Community Center occupied a converted warehouse in a part of the city Marcus rarely visited. The building's exterior showed years of wear, with faded paint and windows protected by security bars. Marcus parked his Mercedes between a rusted pickup truck and a van with a missing hubcap, suddenly aware of how his luxury vehicle announced his wealth in this environment. Dorothy met him at the entrance, dressed in her weekend clothes, a simple floral dress and comfortable shoes. She seemed nervous but determined, greeting Marcus with formal politeness while internally praying that the visit would open his heart rather than confirm his prejudices. Maria Santos appeared in the doorway, a petite woman in her 40s with graying hair and eyes that reflected years of witnessing human struggle. She welcomed Marcus warmly but without excessive enthusiasm, understanding from Dorothy's phone calls that he was reluctant to be there. Mr. Wellington, thank you for taking time to visit us today, Maria said as she led them inside. We're grateful for any interest in understanding the challenges our families face. The interior of the community center bustled with activity. Children played in a supervised area while their parents attended job training workshops or met with counselors. The space felt cramped but organized, with every corner serving multiple purposes. Folding tables hosted everything from homework help to resume writing classes. Marcus noticed the careful efficiency with which the space was used. Nothing was wasted, and every volunteer seemed to understand exactly what needed to be done. Despite the building's limitations, it felt warm and purposeful in ways his spacious mansion never did. Maria began their tour in the children's area, where about 20 kids ranging from toddlers to teenagers were engaged in various activities. Marcus watched a volunteer reading stories to a group of 5-year-olds while older children worked on homework at nearby tables. "These are children from families in our transitional housing program," Maria explained. "Some live in our emergency shelter upstairs. Others are staying with relatives or friends while their parents search for permanent housing." Marcus observed the children carefully, noting their clean clothes and engaged behavior. These weren't the stereotypical homeless children he might have imagined, dirty, defeated, or disruptive. They seemed remarkably normal, laughing at the story being read and helping younger children with their activities. "How long do families typically stay in your programs?" Marcus asked, surprising himself with his genuine curiosity. "It varies greatly," Maria replied. "Some families need just a few weeks to get back on their feet after a temporary crisis. Others require several months to find employment, save money, and secure permanent housing. Our average stay is about 4 months." They moved upstairs to the emergency shelter, a large room lined with bunk beds and divided by curtains to provide minimal privacy for families. Marcus counted 18 beds in the space, noting how closely they were arranged and how personal belongings were stored in small boxes beneath each bed. "This room serves as home for up to 30 people," Maria continued. "We're currently at capacity with a waiting list of over 40 families. Last week we had to turn away a mother with 3 children because we simply had no space." Marcus felt uncomfortable seeing how people lived in such close quarters, but he was struck by the cleanliness and organization of the space. Beds were neatly made, personal areas were tidy, and residents had posted small decorations and photos to personalize their corners. At that moment, Carmen Rodriguez appeared with Isabella and Luis returning from a job interview. Dorothy had arranged for them to be present, hoping their story might resonate with Marcus. Carmen looked tired but maintained her dignity as Maria introduced her to Marcus. "Mrs. Rodriguez has been staying with us for 2 weeks while she searches for employment and affordable housing," Maria explained. "She's been attending our job training program and has several promising interviews scheduled." Isabella, the 9-year-old Dorothy had mentioned, looked up at Marcus with curious eyes. "Are you here to help people find homes?" she asked innocently. "My mom says we're going to have our own place soon with my own bedroom." Marcus felt an unexpected tightness in his chest as he looked at the girl's hopeful face. "I hope your mom finds what she's looking for," he managed to say. Carmen spoke quietly to Marcus. "Mr. Wellington, Mrs. Dorothy told me you have a beautiful home. My children have never lived anywhere with so much space. Sometimes I wonder what it would be like for them to have a yard to play in, or their own rooms to decorate." Marcus nodded awkwardly, unsure how to respond. The contrast between Isabella's modest hopes for her own bedroom and his mansion's 12 empty bedrooms felt suddenly overwhelming. They continued the tour, visiting the job training center where adults learned computer skills and interview techniques. Marcus met James Johnson, who was participating in a construction management course while his wife Patricia attended a childcare certification program. Their twin boys played quietly nearby, occasionally looking up at their parents with expressions that seemed too serious for 6-year-olds. "We had our own house for 8 years, James explained to Marcus. "Lost it when the construction company I worked for went bankrupt. Patricia got laid off the same month. Everything fell apart so fast we couldn't catch up with the bills." Marcus found himself asking practical questions about job markets and housing costs. His business mind automatically began calculating the financial challenges these families faced. The impossible math of minimum wage jobs against rent prices, the catch-22 of needing an address to get employment and needing employment to afford an address. The final stop was a small office where Ashley Thompson was working on a college application with a volunteer tutor. At 16, she carried herself with the careful maturity of someone who had been forced to grow up too quickly. When introduced to Marcus, she shook his hand with professional confidence. "I'm applying for community college scholarships," Ashley explained. "I want to study business management and eventually open my own catering company." I just need to make it through the next few months until graduation. Marcus was impressed by Ashley's articulate presentation of her goals and her detailed business plan. She reminded him of his own determination at her age, though his path had been easier with family support and financial stability. As the tour concluded, Marcus found himself standing in the community center's main room, watching families interact with volunteers and each other. The atmosphere was one of mutual support and shared struggle, very different from the isolated luxury of his daily life. Maria walked him to the entrance. "Thank you for visiting us today, Mr. Wellington. I hope you have a better understanding of what homelessness really looks like and the kind of people who need temporary assistance." Marcus shook her hand, still processing what he had experienced. "You do important work here," he said sincerely. "I can see that these are good families facing difficult circumstances." Dorothy walked with Marcus to their cars, both of them quiet as they absorbed the afternoon's experiences. Finally, Marcus spoke. "Dorothy, I can see why you care about these people. They're not what I expected." He paused, then continued. "But that doesn't change my position about using my home as a shelter. There have to be other ways to help them." Dorothy nodded, understanding that she had achieved something important even if Marcus wasn't ready to offer his lounge. "Thank you for coming today, Mr. Wellington. I know it wasn't easy for you." As Marcus drove home through the gathering darkness, he couldn't shake the images of the families he had met. Isabella's hope for her own bedroom, James's determination to rebuild his family's stability, and Ashley's mature plans for her future lingered in his mind. For the first time in years, his empty mansion felt less like a sanctuary and more like a reminder of how much space one person could occupy, while others had nowhere to go. The week following Marcus's visit to the community center passed in strange tension. He found himself distracted during business meetings, his thoughts drifting to Isabella's innocent questions about finding homes and Ashley's mature determination to build a future despite her circumstances. Dorothy worked with quiet efficiency, but Marcus caught her making phone calls during breaks, speaking in hushed tones that suggested ongoing coordination with the families they had met. On Wednesday evening, Marcus was reviewing property contracts in his home office when he heard unusual sounds from the front of the house. Through his window, he could see Dorothy's car in the driveway, but she should have finished work hours earlier. Curious and slightly alarmed, he walked toward the source of the noise. What Marcus discovered stopped him cold. Dorothy was in the lounge with Carmen Rodriguez and her children, along with James and Patricia Johnson and their twin boys. They were quietly moving in sleeping bags, small suitcases, and boxes of personal belongings. Ashley Thompson was helping arrange temporary beds made from couch cushions and blankets. "What exactly is going on here?" Marcus demanded, his voice sharp with shock and anger. Dorothy turned to face him, her expression showing both defiance and fear. "Mr. Wellington, I know this looks terrible, but please let me explain." "Explain?" Marcus's voice rose. "You've moved homeless people into my house without my permission. This is breaking and entering. This is trespassing." Carmen gathered her children protectively, while James stepped forward as if to shield his family. Ashley stood quietly but alertly, clearly prepared to leave at a moment's notice. Dorothy raised her hands in a calming gesture. "Sir, please don't call the police. These families were evicted from the community center this afternoon because of an emergency inspection. They had nowhere else to go, and it's supposed to rain all night." Marcus stared at the group, his mind racing between anger, disbelief, and something that might have been concern. "Dorothy, this is my private home. You can't just decide to house people here because you think it's a good idea." "I know," Dorothy replied, her voice trembling but determined. "I know I'm probably going to lose my job over this. But I couldn't let these children sleep in the rain when there's space and warmth here." Isabella looked up at Marcus with wide, frightened eyes. "Are you angry with us, sir?" We tried to be very quiet. The direct question from the 9-year-old girl hit Marcus like a physical blow. He looked around the lounge, noting how carefully the families had arranged their makeshift beds, how they had tried to minimize their impact on his space. "How long were you planning to stay here?" Marcus asked, his voice calmer but still tense. Carmen spoke up nervously. "Mrs. Dorothy said maybe just tonight, until the community center can arrange other options tomorrow. We don't want to cause you any trouble." Marcus looked at Dorothy, recognizing the impossible position she had put him in. Calling the police would mean sending families with young children out into the storm. Allowing them to stay would mean accepting the very arrangement he had explicitly rejected. "Dorothy, I need to speak with you privately," he said finally. They walked to the kitchen, leaving the families in uncomfortable silence in the lounge. Marcus's anger was evident, but Dorothy could sense his internal struggle. "How could you do this?" Marcus demanded. "How could you violate my trust and my property this way?" Dorothy met his gaze steadily. "Because I've been cleaning this house for 3 years, watching you live alone in all this space while children sleep in cars. Because when the community center called this afternoon and said these families had been displaced, I couldn't pretend I didn't know about 12 empty bedrooms." Marcus began pacing. "This isn't your decision to make. This is my house, my property, my life." "You're right," Dorothy admitted. "I overstepped every boundary, and I'm probably destroying my job and any chance of helping these families in the future. But I couldn't do nothing when I knew there was space and safety available." Marcus stopped pacing and looked directly at Dorothy. "What happens tomorrow? What's your plan when the community center can't find alternative housing? Do you expect these people to live here indefinitely?" Dorothy had clearly thought about this. "Maria Santos is working with 3 other shelters to place these families by tomorrow evening. This is truly just one night of emergency shelter." Marcus walked to the kitchen window, staring out at the rain that was beginning to fall more heavily. Behind him, he could hear quiet voices from the lounge, parents reassuring their children and organizing their temporary sleeping arrangements. "If I allow this," Marcus said slowly, "if I don't call the police tonight, what guarantee do I have that this won't happen again? What stops you from deciding my house is available whenever there's a housing crisis?" Dorothy understood the larger question behind his words. "Mr. Wellington, if you let them stay tonight, I promise this will never happen again without your explicit permission. I know I've broken your trust, and I know you have every right to fire me." Marcus was quiet for several minutes, wrestling with conflicting impulses. His business training told him to maintain clear boundaries and consequences. His growing awareness of the family's desperation made calling the police feel cruel and unnecessary. Finally, he walked back to the lounge, where the families waited anxiously for his decision. The children had been settled into their makeshift beds, and the adults sat nearby, ready to pack everything quickly if needed. "You can stay tonight," Marcus announced, his voice carefully controlled. "But this arrangement ends tomorrow evening, and it never happens again without my specific approval." The relief on the family's faces was immediate and overwhelming. Carmen began crying quietly, while James and Patricia exchanged looks of gratitude and disbelief. "Thank you, sir," Ashley said simply. "We really appreciate your kindness." Marcus nodded curtly and began to leave, then paused at the doorway. "There are extra blankets in the hall closet if you need them. The kitchen is available if you need to prepare food for the children." As Marcus retreated to his home office, he could hear Dorothy explaining house rules to the families, where bathrooms were located, how to operate the thermostat, and the importance of keeping noise levels low. Despite his anger at her presumption, he found himself impressed by her organization and foresight. Throughout the evening, Marcus found it impossible to concentrate on his work. He was acutely aware of the presence of 8 additional people in his house, but the sounds were different from what he had expected. Instead of disruption and chaos, he heard quiet conversations, children being read bedtime stories, and the gentle sounds of families settling in for the night. Around 10 o'clock, Marcus ventured out of his office to get a drink from the kitchen. Through the lounge doorway, he could see the families arranged in their sleeping areas. The parents were awake, talking quietly while their children slept. The scene struck him as remarkably peaceful and domestic, nothing like the invasion he had feared. Dorothy was cleaning up in the kitchen, organizing supplies and preparing for morning breakfast. When she saw Marcus, she approached him with obvious nervousness. "Mr. Wellington, I want you to know how grateful these families are, and I want to apologize again for putting you in this impossible situation." Marcus studied Dorothy's face, seeing genuine remorse mixed with unwavering conviction. "Dorothy, what you did was completely inappropriate and unacceptable, but I'm beginning to understand why you felt compelled to do it." Dorothy nodded, accepting his criticism, while hoping for some sign of forgiveness. "These are good people who just need a chance to rebuild their lives." Marcus looked toward the lounge again, where the families were settling into sleep. "Tomorrow they leave, and we return to our normal arrangement. But Dorothy, we're going to have a serious conversation about your future employment here." As Dorothy left for the night and Marcus prepared for bed, Both of them understood that something fundamental had changed in their relationship and in Marcus's understanding of his responsibilities to the community around him. The quiet presence of the families in his lounge had transformed his empty house into something that felt more like a home, and that realization both comforted and troubled him deeply. Marcus woke at 6 the next morning to unfamiliar sounds drifting through his house. Instead of the usual silence, he heard water running in the guest bathroom, quiet conversations, and the gentle sounds of children getting ready for the day. For a moment, he lay in bed listening to these domestic rhythms, struck by how different his house felt with families living in it. When he came downstairs for breakfast, Marcus found Dorothy already in the kitchen, preparing a meal that was far more elaborate than his usual coffee and bagel. She was making scrambled eggs, toast, and fresh fruit for everyone, moving efficiently between tasks while coffee brewed and orange juice chilled in glasses. "Good morning, Mr. Wellington," Dorothy said formally, her voice still carrying the tension from the night before. "I hope the noise didn't wake you too early." Marcus shook his head, pouring himself coffee and watching Dorothy work. Through the kitchen doorway, he could see the families in the lounge, packing their belongings efficiently and helping their children prepare for the day ahead. Carmen appeared in the kitchen doorway, looking nervous but determined. "Mr. Wellington, I wanted to thank you personally for letting us stay last night. Mrs. Dorothy told us you weren't expecting guests, and we're grateful you opened your home to us." Marcus nodded awkwardly, unsure how to respond to gratitude for something he hadn't actually chosen to do. "I hope you were comfortable," he managed to say. "Oh yes, sir," Carmen replied. "The children slept better last night than they have in weeks." Isabella said it was like staying in a palace. As if summoned by her name, Isabella appeared beside her mother, dressed in school clothes and carrying a small backpack. She looked up at Marcus with the same direct gaze that had unsettled him the previous week. "Thank you for letting us sleep in your beautiful house," she said solemnly. "My mom says we're going to find our own place soon, but this was the best night I've had since we lost our apartment." Marcus felt that familiar tightness in his chest as he looked down at the 9-year-old girl. "You're welcome, Isabella. I hope you have a good day at school." The morning continued with similar interactions as each family member expressed their gratitude before leaving for work, school, or appointments. James Johnson shook Marcus's hand firmly, explaining that he had a job interview that afternoon and felt more confident after a good night's sleep. Ashley Thompson thanked him professionally before heading to school, mentioning that she had submitted 2 college applications the night before using the mansion's reliable internet connection. By 9 o'clock, all the families had left and Dorothy was cleaning the lounge with particular attention to detail. Marcus watched her work, noting how carefully she was restoring everything to its original condition. The space looked exactly as it had before, showing no signs of having housed 8 people overnight. "Dorothy," Marcus said finally, "we need to have that conversation about your employment here." Dorothy stopped cleaning and turned to face him, her expression resigned. "Yes, sir. I understand if you need to fire me. What I did was completely unacceptable." Marcus walked to the large windows overlooking his garden, gathering his thoughts. "You violated my trust, made decisions about my property without my permission, and put me in an impossible situation," he began. Dorothy nodded, accepting each criticism. "You're absolutely right, Mr. Wellington," Marcus continued. "But what I saw last night challenged every assumption I had about homelessness and about my own responsibilities." He turned to look at Dorothy directly. "Those families weren't what I expected. They were organized, respectful, and grateful. The children were well behaved and the adults were clearly working hard to improve their situations." Dorothy remained quiet, unsure where Marcus was heading with his observations. "I've been thinking about this all night," Marcus continued. "About Isabella wanting her own bedroom, about Ashley's determination to finish school, about how different my house felt with people actually living in it, instead of just me rattling around in all this space." Dorothy dared to hope that Marcus might be reconsidering his position, but she didn't want to push too hard after already overstepping so dramatically. Marcus walked to his home office and returned with a legal pad covered in notes. "I've been making some calculations," he said, "about housing costs, about the economics of temporary shelter, about what it would actually take to convert the lounge into proper emergency housing." Dorothy's eyes widened as she realized what Marcus was saying. "Sir, are you considering the shelter idea?" Marcus sat down in one of the lounge chairs, still holding his notes. I'm considering it, but not the way you originally proposed. If we're going to do this, we're going to do it right, with proper permits, insurance, and professional oversight. Dorothy sat down across from him, hardly believing what she was hearing. What would that look like? Marcus consulted his notes. We'd need to work with social services to establish official procedures for screening and placement. We'd need insurance coverage and safety inspections. We'd need clear agreements about length of stay and behavioral expectations. Dorothy nodded eagerly. Maria Santos could help coordinate all of that. She has experience with temporary housing programs. We'd also need volunteer support for supervision and programming. Marcus continued. I can't have strangers living in my house without proper oversight and support services. Dorothy could barely contain her excitement. The church community would help, and there are retired teachers and social workers who volunteer regularly at the community center. Marcus looked around the lounge, mentally redesigning the space. We could accommodate 6 to 8 people comfortably if we set it up properly. Separate sleeping areas, storage for personal belongings, access to kitchen and bathroom facilities. Dorothy stood up, unable to remain seated. Mr. Wellington, are you really saying yes to the shelter? Marcus held up a hand. I'm saying yes to exploring the possibility seriously. This would be a trial program, maybe 6 months, to see if it can work without disrupting my life too much or creating problems for the neighborhood. Dorothy felt tears forming in her eyes. Sir, this could change so many lives. Those families we met, and dozens of others who are waiting for safe housing. Marcus stood up as well, his business instincts taking over. But Dorothy, this partnership only works if there's complete transparency and communication between us. No more surprise decisions or unauthorized actions. Everything gets discussed and approved beforehand. Dorothy nodded vigorously. Yes, absolutely. I promise, Mr. Wellington. No more surprises. Marcus walked to the kitchen and poured another cup of coffee, his mind already shifting into planning mode. I'll need to meet with my lawyers about liability issues and with my insurance company about coverage. You'll need to work with Maria Santos to develop operational procedures and volunteer schedules. Dorothy followed him, still processing the magnitude of what was happening. How long do you think it will take to get everything set up? Marcus considered the question. If we move quickly and efficiently, maybe 6 weeks. We'll need time to get permits, arrange insurance, and set up proper support systems. Dorothy thought about the families currently on the community center's waiting list. What about immediate needs? There are families who need housing right now. Marcus paused in his planning. We can't help everyone immediately, but maybe we can work with the community center to provide emergency assistance while we're getting the official program established. As the morning continued, Marcus found himself energized by the complexity of the project ahead. His business skills were well suited to navigating bureaucratic requirements and coordinating multiple stakeholders. Dorothy's community connections and understanding of the family's needs would be essential for creating a program that actually served its intended purpose. By noon, they had outlined a comprehensive plan for transforming the mansion's lounge into a temporary shelter that could serve as a model for other communities. Marcus had called his lawyer to begin the permit process, while Dorothy had contacted Maria Santos to schedule a planning meeting. As Dorothy prepared to leave work that afternoon, she turned to Marcus with profound gratitude. Mr. Wellington, I still can't believe you're making this happen. Those families are going to have hope again. Marcus nodded, still somewhat amazed by his own decision. Dorothy, what you did last night was wrong, but it forced me to confront some truths I'd been avoiding. Maybe it's time I use my resources for something more meaningful than just accumulating more wealth. Dorothy smiled, understanding that something fundamental had shifted in Marcus's perspective. Sir, I think you're going to discover that helping others brings a satisfaction that business success never could. Marcus looked around his mansion, imagining it filled with the voices of children and the hope of families rebuilding their lives. I suppose we're about to find out, he said, already looking forward to the challenges and rewards that lay ahead.